They thought they could take my cabin. They thought their rules, their threats, smug little letters in official envelopes would scare me into handing over what my family built with our own hands. But here's the part they didn't expect. Instead of giving in, I built a fence. Not just any fence. A fence around their office. And if you think that's the end of it, you're wrong. It's the way the HOA president and the entire board got humbled at the end of this story. That's the part you need to see. So don't even think about clicking away, because the best revenge isn't quick. It's careful. It all started on a cold morning, kind where frost paints every branch silver, and the air is sharp enough to bite your lungs. I was drinking coffee on the porch of my cabin, staring out at the mist curling off the lake. This was my favorite time of day. No voices, no noise, just the sound of the water lapping at the shore. Then I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A black SUV I'd never seen before pulled into my driveway. Out stepped two people, a man in a suit far too expensive for the forest. There's a woman holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. She didn't smile. She didn't say good morning. She just looked at the cabin like it was an insect she wanted to scrape off her shoe. "Mr. Randall?" she asked. "That's me. We're with the Lakewood Pines Homeowners Association. I'm President Cheryl Darden, and this is our compliance officer." Compliance officer. Out here. For my cabin. She wasted no time. "We're here to inform you that your property is subject to the bylaws of Lakewood Pines, effective immediately. There are several violations you'll need to address: paint color, fencing materials, landscaping, and unfortunately, this cabin's exterior does not meet our approved aesthetic standards." I just stared at her because I wasn't part of their neighborhood. My cabin wasn't even on their map. I told her that, calmly. Her lips curled into something between a smile and a sneer. "There's been a boundary adjustment. You're now within our jurisdiction. All property owners are required to comply." Boundary adjustment, no notice, no meeting, no vote, just suddenly, they claimed they owned the right to tell me how. To live on land my grandfather had bought before half of their houses even existed. I could feel my pulse in my ears. Not gonna happen. Her smile didn't falter. She handed me a packet thick enough to choke a mule. "Failure to comply will result in daily fines, legal action, and possible foreclosure." Foreclosure. Over paint, color, and siding. That was the moment the war started. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept seeing my grandfather's hands, rough, scarred from years of carpentry, hammering the nails into this place. I thought about the summers I'd spent here as a kid, fishing off the dock, stacking firewood, fixing the roof after storms. This wasn't just property, this was history, and they thought they could take it because their map suddenly said so. The next morning I drove into town and pulled the property deeds. I confirmed what I already knew. My land had never been part of Lakewood Pines, but sure enough, there was a brand new survey tucked into the county records, drawn up by a company I'd never heard of, signed by a planning consultant who just happened to be Cheryl, Darden's brother-in-law. That's when I realized this wasn't incompetence. This was calculated. I made calls. I reached out to a lawyer friend in the next county over, someone who didn't mind getting his hands dirty. He told me the new survey was technically filed, but there were serious holes in it. Wanted to fight? I had a case. The problem? HOA boards thrive on dragging people into legal hell. You know, most folks won't spend the time or money to fight back. They count on exhaustion and fear, so I decided not to fight them the normal way. I started small. When Cheryl's compliance officer came back a week later to inspect, I greeted him with coffee and a camera recording every word. Every time. He cited me for a violation. I asked him to point to the specific bylaw in writing. He couldn't. I started posting the videos online. Cabin versus HOA. Day 1, Day 3, Day 7. People started following. Neighbors whispered. Then came the first twist. A letter saying I owed $1,450 in initial fines. They hadn't even proven jurisdiction, but they were already stacking the numbers. That's when I paid a quiet visit to the HOA office. It was a squat little building in the middle of their community center, right next to the pool and tennis courts. The office was open to the public, so I wandered in, and accidentally struck up a conversation with their secretary. She didn't know who I was at first. By the time she figured it out, I'd already seen their bulletin board, including their list of fines for members who hadn't paid HOA dues. Turns out, Cheryl's own vice president was 6 months behind. Now, here's where things start to get fun. I didn't tell anyone what I knew. I didn't send an angry letter or call them out online. I waited. I let them think I was cornered. Meanwhile, I started building. At first it was just some lumber deliveries, then concrete posts, then heavy-duty locking gates, neighbors thought. Maybe I was putting up a privacy fence, but I wasn't building it around my cabin. I was building it around their office. It took 3 weeks of careful, quiet work. Every day I'd show up early in the morning before their office opened and add a little more. Post holes, panels, chain link sections, reinforced with wood. It's a kind of fence you'd put around a construction site or a prison yard. By the time they realized what I was doing, my sides were already up. Cheryl stormed out one afternoon, face red, voice shaking. "You can't do this. This is HOA property." I just smiled. "Oh, I'm not touching your property. County maps show the land under this building is technically public easement. And as a member of the public, I'm allowed to place temporary safety barriers for community events, which, by the way, I've just scheduled." She didn't know what to say. The truth was, I'd found a loophole. The easement meant their office technically sat on land accessible to everyone in town, not just HOA members. And local law allowed temporary enclosures for safety as long as they didn't restrict emergency access, which meant legally fence them in with a locked gate, as long as I posted the code for emergency services on the outside. But here's the thing. This wasn't the final move. This was just the setup. Because while they were busy trying to figure out how to get around my fence, I was digging deeper into their finances, their fake survey, their backroom deals. And I was finding more dirt than I'd even hoped for. Real twist? The more I looked, the more I realized they weren't just trying to take my cabin. They were using the boundary expansion as a way to grab multiple properties along the lake, places with high resale value. And mine just happened to be the first on the list. That's when I knew the humbling they had coming wasn't going to just make them look foolish. It was going to take down the entire board. And if you think the fence was my revenge, oh no, that was just me setting the stage. The real payback is coming. And when it hits, every single person who's ever been bullied by an HOA is going to want to watch it happen. So stick with me, because the next part is where the traps start snapping shut. The fence was up, but that wasn't the victory. It was the bait. And like clockwork, they bit. 3 days after the last panel went in, I got my first official letter from the HOA demanding immediate removal of an unauthorized structure obstructing HOA operations. They had no idea I'd already taken this further than a fence. You see? Before I even poured the first post hole, I'd filed paperwork with the county to host a public heritage festival in honor of my grandfather, who had built the cabin. The location, that exact public easement their office sat on. The permit gave me exclusive temporary event control over the area for installation of historical exhibits, safety barriers, and restricted zones. In other words, I didn't just build a fence, I made it official. And they couldn't legally touch it without violating county event law. I knew they'd try anyway. On the 4th day, I drove into town early, coffee in hand, and parked across the street from their office. Sure enough, Cheryl and 2 board members were standing outside the gate arguing with a sheriff's deputy. I stepped out of my truck, walked over, and handed the deputy a copy of my permit. "Morning, officer. Everything in order here?" Cheryl's voice was a high-pitched hiss. "This is ridiculous. He's blocking our building." The deputy looked at the paper, looked at me, then back at her. "He's got the permit, ma'am. Says here he's allowed to have this fence until the end of the month." The way Cheryl's jaw clenched, you'd think she was trying to bite through steel. I walked away before she could say another word. But here's the thing about revenge. You can't just win the battle. You have to burn their playbook, so they can't come at you again. While they were stewing about the fence, I was busy digging into their boundary expansion. My lawyer friend found that the surveyor who filed it had been paid through an HOA beautification fund, which meant members. Dues had gone to pay for the paperwork that gave them power they didn't actually have. Even better, that fund wasn't in their official annual budget, which meant it was a slush fund. I had the receipts, literally. I'd pulled payment records from the county after filing a public information request. Every dollar traced back to HOA dues. Now, I could have gone straight to the state HOA oversight committee. But no, that would have been too quick too. Clean. I wanted the members themselves to turn on the board, so I printed copies of the payment records. I stapled them to flyers with a simple headline. Do you know where your HOA dues are going? I didn't put my name on them. I didn't have to. I just left stacks in the community mailbox areas, at the pool gate, even on the counter in the HOA's own lobby before it was fenced in. Within 2 days, the gossip was wildfire. I wasn't done. Remember the vice president who was 6 months behind on dues? I mailed an anonymous letter to every board member with a copy of his delinquency notice from their own records. Then I sent a different letter to every homeowner with the same information, minus the name, but with enough hints that anyone paying attention could figure it out by the end of the week. Half the neighborhood knew someone on the board wasn't paying their own dues and still hadn't touched the real weapon. See, the cabin wasn't just some sentimental piece of land. My grandfather had built it on a plot with special status. It had an old heritage designation because the original foundation was over 100 years old. That designation meant any attempt to alter the structure without approval from the State Historical Society was a big no-no. Guess what the HOA was threatening me with? Mandatory aesthetic upgrades that would have changed the entire exterior, so I filed a formal complaint with the Historical Society. As the party trying to force illegal alterations, that complaint became public record, which meant journalists could see it, and one did. The first article hit the local paper on a Tuesday morning. Cabin owner battles HOA over historic landmark. It painted me as the little guy standing up. 2 corporate bullies. I quoted my grandfather's history with the land. It even showed a picture of the fence, with Cheryl's scowling face in the background. By that afternoon, my phone was blowing up with interview requests. The HOA was probably blowing up too, but with angry members, demanding answers. You'd think they'd cut their losses. You'd think they'd try to smooth things over. But no. Cheryl doubled down on Friday. I got a letter saying they'd voted to initiate legal proceedings to force me into compliance. They gave me 14 days to remove all unauthorized structures, meaning the fence, the cabin porch additions, even my grandfather's hand-carved sign over the door. I knew exactly what that meant. They were trying to drain me with legal fees, but they'd made a mistake by putting it in writing. They'd acknowledged the cabin was mine, no boundary expansion wording, no new jurisdiction claim. Just your property in black and white, which made their entire survey. Argument looked like a power grab, and then came the best twist yet. My lawyer friend found that the HOA's own bylaws included a clause buried deep in the legal jargon, stating that any boundary changes had to be approved by a 2/3 vote of all dues-paying members. You know what they'd never done? Held that vote, which meant the boundary change was null and void, which meant they had zero legal authority over my cabin from day one, and I had proof. The night I found out, I sat on my porch under a sky full of stars and thought about ending it right there, sending the proof to the state, getting the whole thing shut down. But I realized something. Ending it now would just make them slip away quietly. I wanted them to face their own members. I wanted them to stand in front of a crowd and explain themselves. So I waited. I let the fence stay up. I let the gossip grow. I let the frustration boil over until the HOA announced a special meeting to address community concerns. I knew this was it. The night of the meeting, I parked just outside their community hall and watched the lot fill up. People carried stacks of papers, my flyers, my copies of the slush fund receipts, the news article. I didn't even go in. I didn't have to. I just waited across the street until the shouting started. You could hear it through the glass. Accusations, demands, Cheryl's voice trying to shout over them. People left early, slamming the doors. One woman threw her HOA membership card into the parking lot and drove away. By the end of the night, 3 board members had resigned, and still, the revenge wasn't done. because the humbling was going to be public. It was going to be something everyone in town remembered. I knew exactly how to do it. That's for the next part. Trust me, you're going to want to see what happens when a fence becomes the smallest part of the story. The fallout from the meeting didn't stop at the community hall doors, where it spread fast in small towns, and by morning, the story had reached places I hadn't expected. Shopkeepers whispered about it to customers. The post office clerk gave me a knowing smirk when she handed over my mail. Even the guy at the bait shop, who barely talked to anyone, asked if it was true the HOA had lost half its board overnight. The fence still stood, it's tall and unyielding around their office. The padlocked gate was untouched, the posted emergency access code still taped to the outside in compliance with county law. But it was more than just a barrier, now it had become a symbol. People came by just to look at it, to take photos, to shake their heads at the absurdity of a homeowners association locked out of its own headquarters. Inside that fence, the grass grew longer. Weeds pushed through the cracks in the walkway. Piles of unopened mail stacked up behind the office door. Their once pristine community center had become a ghost building, a monument to stubbornness and miscalculation. I kept my distance in those first few days after the meeting. I didn't need to be seen gloating. I wanted the silence to work on them, to let every HOA member feel the absence of leadership and the weight of unanswered questions. Meanwhile, the nullified boundary change was one thing, but we wanted a clean, irrefutable record that would close the book on any future attempts. That meant taking everything, every misfiled document, every bylaw they'd broken, every dime that had gone through the slush fund and organizing it into a package that even the laziest county official couldn't ignore. It took 2 weeks of sorting, photocopying, and building timelines. When it was done, the binder was thick enough to stop a bullet. On the cover, I wrote a single word in bold marker: evidence. While I handled the paperwork, something else began happening. Members of the HOA started showing up at my cabin. First, they came cautiously, like people approaching a dog they weren't sure was friendly. But once the first few conversations went well, the rest followed. Some apologized for what the board had tried to do. Others offered information, old meeting notes, past complaints. Even copies of emails where Cheryl had threatened members into silence. The more they talked, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't just about my cabin. This board had been running their HOA like a personal fiefdom for years, hiding behind rules most people never bothered to read. Then one evening, a man in his 60s knocked on my door. He introduced himself as Carl, a former board treasurer who'd resigned years earlier. Carl told me about a storage unit the HOA kept on the edge of town, supposedly for archived records. He had a key. The next day, we drove out there. The storage unit was small and smelled faintly of mildew. Inside were file boxes stacked haphazardly, many of them unlabeled. We started digging. What we found made the slush fund look like pocket change. There were invoices for landscaping projects that had never happened, checks written to companies that didn't exist, receipts for lavish dinners, spa treatments, and even a trip to Las Vegas, all billed to the HOA under community development. Every document went into the binder. By the time we were done, the evidence against them wasn't just overwhelming. It was enough to raise questions about criminal charges. The next step was making sure this didn't just get buried in some bureaucrat's desk. So instead of sending it straight to the county, I mailed copies to 3 different places: the State HOA Oversight Committee, the county attorney's office, and a local journalist who had already shown an appetite for the story. It was only a matter of days before the journalist called me. She'd gone through the binder and she wanted to publish. I told her to hold off until the Oversight Committee had made their move. She agreed, but she was itching to go to print. Meanwhile, Cheryl and the remaining board members tried to put on a brave face. They sent out a newsletter declaring they were investigating recent misunderstandings and promising positive changes in the near future. It didn't land. The residents had seen too much, heard too much. Then the county attorney's office called. They wanted to meet. The meeting took place in a neutral space, a rented conference room at a law office downtown. My lawyer came with me. Across the table sat 2 county officials, a clerk taking notes, and a man from the state committee. They asked me to walk them through the binder. I did, page by page, explaining where each document came from and how it connected to the larger pattern. When I finished, the man from the state committee closed the binder and looked at the county attorney. "This is more than enough to justify a full audit and possible criminal referral." The county attorney nodded. "We'll move forward immediately." Word of the audit reached the HOA within 48 hours. Cheryl's voice, once so sharp and commanding, sounded small in the voicemail she left me. She said she wanted to clear the air and find a resolution that works for everyone. I didn't call her back. The audit team moved quickly. They seized financial records from the HOA office after getting the combination to the gate from the emergency code I'd posted months earlier. They visited the storage unit Carl had shown me. They interviewed former board members, vendors, and even the compliance officer who had first come to my cabin. It didn't take long for the results to surface. The audit confirmed misuse of funds, unauthorized expenditures, and illegal boundary expansion attempts. The state committee issued a formal censure of the entire board and recommended they resign immediately. 3 days later, they did. Cheryl didn't show her face in public for weeks. With the board dissolved, a temporary committee was appointed to manage the HOA's affairs until new elections could be held. Several of the people who'd come to me with information ended up on that committee. The first thing they did was vote to remove any claim of jurisdiction over properties like mine. The fence around their office stayed up for another month, not because I needed it there, but because nobody wanted to take it down. It had become a landmark, a quiet reminder that even the most overbearing authority can be caged if you know where to push. Eventually, I dismantled it myself, piece by piece, stacking the panels in my truck. As I worked, a few residents stopped by to help. One of them, a woman who'd lived in Lakewood Pines for 20 years, shook her head and said, "I never thought anyone could stand up to them like that." I didn't say much in response. The satisfaction wasn't in the praise, it was in the silence that followed. The knowledge that no one would come up my driveway with a clipboard again. When the last panel was loaded, I took a slow drive past the office. The grass had been cut, the weeds pulled, the windows washed. A new sign hung over the door, Community Resource Center. It was no longer an HOA headquarters. At the lake, the water was calm, the air cool. The cabin stood just as it had before. All this began, cedar siding weathered, stone chimney solid. I poured myself a coffee and sat on the porch, watching the mist curl off the water. For the first time in months, there was nothing on my calendar but peace. Spring came late that year. The last patches of snow clung to the shaded edges of the forest, stubborn in the face of warmer days. The lake was restless, thawing in jagged sheets that groaned and shifted against the shore. I had fallen into a rhythm again: morning coffee, repairs to the cabin. Afternoons spent clearing brush or walking the trails my grandfather once cut with a hand axe. Life was quiet. Quiet has a way of making you hear what's left unsaid. There were loose ends, threads I hadn't pulled, and I knew better than to leave them hanging. The board was gone, but their shadow lingered in the neighborhood. The temporary committee was busy cleaning up the mess, but the truth was, the deeper problems ran back years before Cheryl ever stepped into the president's chair. It was Carl who came to me first with the idea. He stopped by one Saturday with a manila envelope under his arm and a serious look on his face. We sat at my kitchen table while he slid the contents out, meeting minutes from more than a decade ago. Some typed, some handwritten. "These are from before my time," he said. "You'll see the same names over and over again. It's not just Cheryl. The same people have been running that board in one form or another for almost 20 years. He wasn't exaggerating. The documents told a story of elections where only one candidate's name appeared on the ballot. Special appointments filling vacant seats without member votes. Of quiet changes to bylaws that concentrated more authority in fewer hands. Knew then that if the new elections were going to mean anything, they couldn't just be about replacing a few names. The whole system had to be rebuilt from the ground up. The committee had already set the election date for early summer. It gave us a window of 3 months. I spent that time walking door to door through Lakewood Pines, meeting homeowners who'd never been to a meeting, listening to their stories. Some had been fined for absurd infractions: grass half an inch too high, a flower bed with unapproved colors, a child's swing set visible from the road. Others had paid fees they didn't understand just to avoid conflict. I didn't campaign. I wasn't running for anything, but I did something that mattered more. I asked questions, and I listened. Every conversation ended with another piece of the puzzle, another person ready to see the whole picture instead of the narrow one the board had given them for years. Meanwhile, the committee was working on amending the bylaws. They brought in an outside legal advisor to ensure every change met state requirements. The clause that had allowed boundary expansions without proper votes was struck entirely. So were the vague aesthetic standards that had been used as a weapon against residents. The day the revised bylaws were posted for public review, I saw something I hadn't in all the time I'd known this community: hope. People stood in small groups reading the changes, pointing to sections, nodding. The mood was cautious but lighter. Still, I didn't trust it to hold without something stronger than good intentions. A week before the election, I made another visit to the county records office. This time, I wasn't looking for surveys or deeds. I wanted to see every property lien the HOA had ever filed. There were more than I expected. Some had been legitimate, for unpaid dues on abandoned properties, but others were questionable. In particular stood out a small house near the edge of the neighborhood, foreclosed on 3 years earlier. The lien had been for less than $200 in unpaid maintenance fees. The house had been sold to a development company for a fraction of its value. I found the original owner in the next town over, living with her sister. She was in her 70s, sharpened, despite the years. When I asked about the foreclosure, she told me it had come out of nowhere. She'd been in the hospital for surgery, and by the time she got home, the notice was already on her door. She'd tried to fight it, but didn't have the money for a lawyer. When I told her the board that had done it was gone, she didn't smile. "Doesn't matter," she said. "What's done is done." I left her house with the uneasy feeling that some wrongs can't be undone, but they can be prevented from happening again. The election day came clear and warm, the kind of day that draws people outside. The community center was busy from the moment the doors opened. For once, the ballot had more names than positions, and residents were talking to each other in the parking lot, comparing choices, debating politely. By late afternoon, the votes were counted. A completely new board had been elected. Carl was among them, along with 2 younger residents who had never served before. The room broke into applause when the results were announced, not for any one person, but for the sense that something had shifted for good. I left quietly, letting them have their moment. That evening, I walked down to the lake. The water was still, the sky streaked with the last light of day. I thought about my grandfather, about the cabin, about the months of tension and the small victories that had built to this point. It could have ended there, but the following week, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. Cheryl, standing outside a storefront in the next county over. The sign above her head read Property Solutions Group. I didn't need to look twice to understand she'd landed somewhere else, doing the same kind of work under a different name. For a moment, the old anger stirred. Then I folded the photograph and tucked it into a drawer. She wasn't my problem anymore. The fight here was over, and it had been won the right way. In the weeks that followed, I repaired the last of the winter damage to the cabin, replaced a few boards on the porch, and roiled the cedar siding. Neighbors still stopped by sometimes to talk, to thank me, or just to share a coffee. There was no more talk of fines, no more surprise visits with clipboards. One afternoon, a group of kids came tearing down the dirt road on their bikes, laughing so loud it startled a heron into flight from the water's edge. I watched them disappear into the trees, and for the first time since this began, I felt like things were as they should be. The cabin would stand. The lake would keep its quiet mornings, and the people here could live without fear of a letter in the mail dictating the color of their front door, and somewhere beyond the pines, the world went on as it always had. But here, on this patch of land my grandfather had chosen, the fight was finished. The fence was gone, but its shadow remained. As a barrier, but as a memory of the day the balance shifted and the rules stopped belonging to the few.